Well, hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name's Jonty Bloom. I worked at the BBC for about 30 years in journalism for 35, including periods as Europe correspondent, but mainly as a kind of economics and business specialist. I left about 3 years ago because of a round of cuts, and I've been a freelance journalist ever since. I've got a weekly column in the New European, which I hope you will buy. And also, I do a daily blog called Jonty's Jottings, which some of you may already get, which is just me ranting about Brexit, basically. But as I was saying to Gavin earlier, I was a bit worried I wouldn't have anything to say this time, because I did give a speech a while ago, and I didn't think much changed. And then by the time it came around, I just wondered how I was going to get everything in. So we are living in what the Chinese would call interesting times. Everything is changing very, very quickly. And I've written an article for the New European for next week, so I'm basically going to base this chat on that, because I think it's quite prescient. What they asked was, how the hell did we get here, and how do we get out of it? The getting out of it will take up a relatively small amount of time, because it's fairly simple. It's not going to happen, but it's fairly simple. And the problem is that this government seems to be committed to continuing on what is a pretty suicidal path. So you probably didn't notice it, but the FT does a series of articles, one a week, in which they take a prominent business person or academic or leader out for lunch, and they just base the interview around the lunch. And last week's was actually a very, very timely one with Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. And he was trying to be very diplomatic, and he didn't want to actually say anything about Brexit, but they pushed him. And this is what he said. He said, put it this way, in 2016, the British economy was 90% the size of Germany's, and now it's less than 70% of the size of Germany's. And you can insert a picture there of Mark Carney kind of dropping the microphone and walking away, having, totally destroyed the argument about Brexit in one quote. But the picture's even grimmer than that now, and that interview was only last week or so. The Brexit ultras, basically after 6 years, have finally got their hands on the country's finances, and they managed to wreck them in half an hour. That's all it took. Kwasi Kwarteng's speech was half an hour, and the markets tanked. And the big thing about that is it was everything that the Brexiteers and the ultras had ever dreamt of. You will have seen some of the headlines by people like Alistair Heath and in the Mail and everything. The first real Tory budget in 12 years. It was a ruthless, greed is good financial statement, which in the middle of a cost of living crisis, which means that millions of poor people out there are making decisions about whether they eat or the children eat, or whether they turn the central heating on or eat, where food banks are reporting that people are saying, can you give us food which we don't have to cook? And can you give us food that doesn't have to go in a fridge? Because we can't afford to turn the fridge or the cooker on. That's how bad things are. And what they did was they gave billions to wealthy people and nothing to the poor. Anyone who earned or earns under £150,000 was worse off. Anybody who earned over £150,000 was better off. And that was just the £2 billion of £45 billion of unfunded giveaways. So there was corporation tax cuts, there was reversal of national insurance increases, there was numerous other things. And they also took away the banker's bonus cap, all in the middle of this amazing downturn. And yet you still hear them saying, oh, well, the money for the very rich, that was only 2 billion. That's not the cause of all this problem. But it is, because it was the straw that broke the camel's back. They basically devised a method of giving money to help with the fuel and heating crisis, which was appallingly inefficient and gives exactly the same help to me. And I can afford increases in fuel bills. It's not nice. It will cost me. I mean, I can't do something else, but I can afford it. Gives me the same help as my mother-in-law, who desperately needs the money. It gives the same money to millionaires as it does to poor people. And therefore, it's vastly more expensive than it should be. It's basically borrowing money from poor people to give them some help with their fuel bills, and rich people help with their fuel bills, and then having the poor people pay it back over 30 years. No windfall tax worth its name on the oil or energy companies. And don't forget that the price of electricity has gone up, whether it's produced by gas or solar or wind or nuclear or hydroelectric or whatever, none of which have seen their costs increase. So a windfall tax on the oil giants, the gas giants, the electricity generators would have raised enough money to do all this, and the government refused to do it because it doesn't like taxing companies, even when they make windfall profits, even when the head of Shell is saying, please, taxes, it's a socially responsible thing to do, taxes. They won't do it. The consequences of that were that the markets lost complete faith in the Conservative government's fiscal and monetary senses of responsibility and prudence, and the cost of borrowing shot up. It was quite ironic that Mark Carney, who was governor of the Bank of England at the time of the Brexit referendum, had to step in to steady the markets the day after, when I was sitting in a radio car outside the Bank of England reporting on the collapse in the value of the pound. And when the Brexit ultras finally got their hands on the reins of power and money, his successor, Andrew Bailey, had to do exactly the same thing and to step in to protect the markets, and especially people's pension funds, which were in danger of going bust, purely because of the actions of those same Brexit supporters. So you can see how much damage they've done to the economy over 6 years. But that was just a knee-jerk reaction of the financial markets to what was an amazingly stupid and ideologically driven budget, the kind of thing that the Taxpayers Alliance and the IEA and the Adam Smith Institute and the UKIPers and the kind of conservatives who are members and prop up golf bars around the country have been wittering on about for years. They finally got it. It turned out to be a disaster. And now they're trying to come to terms with it. They still, most of them can't see that it was Brexit that caused it, but some people are coming round. So how did we get here, and what's the way out of it? I always start with David Cameron, who didn't have to have a referendum and was stupid enough to hold it and lose it. But what he also did, as you probably remember, he then came out of number 10 Downing Street the day after the referendum, said, I know I said I'd stay on if I lost the referendum, but I've decided to go, and then walked off humming into the sunset. He actually hummed a tune to himself while the microphones were still on, as he walked off without a care in the world. What happened as a result of that was that a referendum that had basically been an anti-immigration, anti-austerity, give more money to the NHS, kind of English nationalism victory, was taken over by the ultras. The second it happened, it was taken over by the ultras. It became, we won't stay in the single market, even though we promised we'd stay in the single market. We cannot have anything to do with the EU. We hate it. It's a slave state. We must have our freedom. We must break every connection with the EU. And that is the basis of all the problems we've had since. It was made considerably worse by Theresa May, who, when she got to number 10, immediately set out red lines on we can't have any immigration, we can't have any a role for the ECJ. I can't remember what the other ones were, but basically the EU produced a very nice chart for anybody who wanted to see it, which was basically what those red lines meant. And it was at the top, it was you stay in the EU, and then it was, well, you leave the EU, but you stay in the single market and the customs union. And then it was, well, you stay in the single market, but not the customs union. And then it was you leave, and then they went down. And eventually, what the red lines meant was you can have a trade deal like Canada's, and that's it. There's no other way of having any of those other benefits. So she by that statement on the red lines, she destroyed any chance of us negotiating a better deal. It handcuffed all her negotiators. It basically made the deal we eventually got inevitable. They spent years negotiating it, but it was perfectly obvious what we were going to get from that very first day when she put out those red lines. So that was an act of absolute stupidity. It was a really appalling negotiating decision. And the negotiations themselves were mishandled from the very start by David Davis originally, then by Theresa May, who basically took them over from him, and subsequently by Lord Frost, who, frankly, I can hardly mention his name without swearing. The negotiations were mishandled, but also on their shoulders, our negotiators always had the ultras saying, oh, well, WTO terms would be perfect. No country in the world trades only on WTO terms. Actually, I think Mauritania does, on the grounds that the only thing it ever sells is bauxite or something. I mean, it just doesn't bother. Nobody does this. Then it was, the UK holds all the cards, the German car industry will come to our rescue, we've got the EU over the barrel. It was ludicrous. How do you negotiate when you've got people in your own party basically telling you just walk away, it won't matter? It was impossible. And so there were numerous things that the EU was willing to offer us that we basically spat in their face and said, no, we don't want it. Things like making it easy for musicians and actors and so on to travel around Europe on concert tours. They offered us something on that, and we said no thanks. Utter disaster. If you'd basically sat down and said, what can we ask for that might cost us a bit of money, might be a bit of a compromise, but it would be vastly helpful for us still to have. It would have been things like staying in Erasmus, which is the student exchange system, visa-free movement for business people around Europe, agreement on common regulations, membership of industry regulation bodies like REACH, which is chemical industries one, veterinary and food standards agreements, cooperation on law and order, data transfer rules, which is something I wrote an article on only the other day. There's dozens more of them. That doesn't mean there wouldn't have been economic damage from Brexit, but it would have sweetened the pill. It would have saved companies millions, if not billions. It would have given them reassurance. It would have smoothed the borders. I mean, it would have far less red tape if you had any of those things. And it would have ensured good, if not brilliant, access to our largest and nearest markets. But even when that deal, the deal in which we just rejected any of the things that might actually be quite handy for us, was presented to the Tory party, they rejected it and kicked out the Prime Minister. Theresa May was basically defenestrated in a coup, led by the very people who'd been undermining her negotiation, by the way, which we all know. And the victor was Boris Johnson in the resulting leadership competition, who then made things even worse. I mean, leaving aside his complete unsuitability to even be a dog catcher in 1960s Alabama, the Prime Minister was a pathetic negotiator. He basically split up the UK by putting a border down the Irish Sea, which he said he would never do. And Theresa May said no Prime Minister would ever agree to. And then he just lied about it. I've got the card stuck on a cork board here of a person I talk to in Northern Ireland quite regularly. He's head of manufacturing Northern Ireland. He's the guy who filmed Boris Johnson at a drinks do in Northern Ireland saying, if anyone ever asks you to fill out some forms, tell me about it and I'll tell you to throw them in the bin. And the average lorry load of goods traveling between Great Britain and Northern Ireland now needs something like 70 or 100 pages of forms, and every single one of them has to be filled out correctly. He just lied. We know he lied because the Treasury and the Civil Service have released their own assessment, which they wrote at the time of what it would mean, and it said, there will be this red tape, there will be this border. We also know it's a lie because he then found the money to build the buildings in which all this paperwork would be checked. But that's what we got. We got a deal in which the Northern Ireland Protocol happened. We burnt all our bridges with the EU, and then he sold it to the British public with the greatest lie ever, which was, this is an oven-ready deal. But even then, the economic consequences were very well known. The Treasury had done its own report. The OBR had done its own report. And their basic calculation was that deal, which we all knew would be like the Canadian deal, would cost us between 4 and 6% of our GDP. That now looks to be an underestimate. If you look at the economic damage, such as we've had in the last week, and the fact that our reputation has been destroyed, it just adds to the knowledge we have about what's going on. There was a briefing by the IFS last week, which I watched, in which they were cooperating with Citibank, and Citibank just stood up and said, that's 6%, it's an underestimate. If you look at what's happening now, this is the consequence of Brexit. And it's much, much worse than we thought. And some of the reasons for that are fairly obvious. The Treasury and the Office for Budget Responsibility basically base their calculations on, well, we're going to have a Canadian-style trade deal, but after that, everything will settle down. Companies will get used to it. They'll just put up with a bit more red tape. Government will cooperate. It will try and ameliorate the worst effects. None of that happened. We immediately had the ultras once again attacking the deal they negotiated themselves. Remember all that stuff about, oh, the Treaty of Vienna says we can just tear up this trade agreement anytime we want and walk away from it. And let's do that and go to WTO trade terms again. That old one started again. We can tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol, break international law, and we'll get away with it. Well, a person called Liz Truss, who was Foreign Secretary until recently, was in charge of passing the act through Parliament, which would have done that. It's still proceeding through Parliament as far as we know at the moment. I think it's dead in the water, but that was the plan. And you've got to ask yourself, who would invest in a country where the ultras are undermining the deal it only wrote and signed a couple of years ago? Who would invest in a country which says it can break its word and the law anytime it feels like it? Who would invest in a country which is trying to start a trade war with its largest trading partners? All those things that the Treasury assumed would happen, like sensible policies and common sense and everything, didn't happen. That's why we think the damage is going to be even worse. And if you look at the predictions, which are now coming out, don't just look at the recession is going to be far worse than it was because of what's happened in the last couple of weeks. But if you look at the economic forecasts going out for 5 years, it's 0.8% a year for 3, 4, 5 years. When the trend growth for the UK economy used to be 2.5%, it's now a third. We cannot afford to find more money for the NHS, for social care, for pensions, when the economy is growing at 0.8%. It's just not there. It's higher taxes, or it's worse services, or it's more borrowing. And the markets have just told us we can't borrow anymore. So we're pretty much screwed. And we've already got high tax rates. Historically, they're not that high. I mean, we could easily survive with higher tax rates than this, but in the UK, it's politically impossible to say that or introduce them without being accused of being some kind of, communist or something like that. Tax rates are much higher in Sweden and France and Germany, and they have perfectly well-run dynamic economies. I was recently in France on a holiday. I had a very bad fall. I was fine, but I went to the doctor's and she said, "Oh, you better have a scan just to check you haven't ruptured your spleen, and I'll write you some prescriptions, but you'll have to pay me." And I thought, oh God, how much is this going to cost? Oh, by the way, I went along at 9 o'clock and said, "Can I have an appointment? Can I see a doctor?" And I said, "Oh no, sorry, there's no one available till 10. So I saw somebody within the hour. She charged me €23 for the appointment. Sent me along to the local hospital. I walked straight into the scanning area. It was empty. I was scanned within 10 minutes. I had the consultation with the consultant within 20 minutes, a full written report. It was €110, including a full body scan. And then I went to pick up the prescriptions, 4 prescriptions, €13 in total. That is what happens when you pay taxes year after year after year, and you invest in your infrastructure and your health system and things like that, right? That is why our health system is falling apart. We have not spent anything like that amount of money on the system. And this is going to get worse. There is no way we have enough money, or this government actually is going to find enough money to put these things right. Meanwhile, the UK trade is collapsing. We are doing between 20 and 30% less international trade than we would have done if Brexit hadn't happened. The trade deficit is an all-time high. There is some confusion over data connected with COVID, but you can check it against other countries' data. One of the most damning bits of evidence about Brexit is what has happened to German exports and imports since COVID ended. They are importing and exporting about 20% more with China, 15% more with America, 17 or 18% more with the Eurozone. So, you know, the exports and imports are zooming ahead, bouncing back. Their imports and exports with the UK are up 2 or 3%. So we are 5 times worse at trading with Germany. Our recovery of trade is 5 times less than it should be. And the simple fact is that many small companies, both in Germany and here, have just decided the game is not worth the candle. The red tape, which costs £7 billion a year in just form filling at Dover, is not worth it. The VAT rules, which means that you now have to register every import and pay VAT on it, it's not worth it. Small companies have stopped doing that, but also large companies have stopped. We know that German industry has basically cut British companies out of its supply chain. They've just gone elsewhere. They've gone to Poland, they've gone to Austria, they've gone to the Czech Republic, they've gone to Spain. It's not worth it. So when you see the announcement that the new Mini, the electric Mini, will now partly be built in China, that, you know, that is just what's happening. People in manufacturing industry basically say there is no future for large-scale car making in the UK. It is dying. It'll take 10 years, it'll take 20 years, it'll die. The government has said, oh, well, electric cars are the future. We're going to invest heavily in making new batteries, these mega gig factories, which are springing up everywhere. The major one is a startup by a company called British Volt. They have now had to go to the markets to try to raise money because they're going broke. And that's only one factory. There are more mega gig factories being built around Berlin than the whole of the UK. There are more in Sweden than the whole of the UK. There are more in France than the whole of the UK. And the reason this is vitally important is the batteries of the future are so large and heavy and expensive and such an integral part of new electric vehicles that basically you have to build them next to the car plant. It's not worth transporting them around the world. You build them and the car plant is next door. And that means that the car manufacturing will be in China or Japan or America, or on the continent, it won't be in the UK. Those are the kind of things that we would have been involved in at a European level if we'd stayed in the EU. We would have lobbied, we would have got funds, we would have attracted them. They've gone elsewhere. So those are the kind of long-term costs. When Boris Johnson finally went, there was the campaign between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And I held out the vague hope that she was just telling the party faithful what they wanted to hear, and that when she got the top job, she'd be a sensible person. I should have known better because I read Britannia Unchained, which was the book that she and Kwasi Kwarteng and a few other people wrote. An absolute terrible pamphlet of economic incompetence and right-wing fantasies. If any of you have heard of the works of Ayn Rand, which is basically fascist capitalism, that, you know, the rich should just be paid anything they want and pay no taxes, and the rest of us should be grateful. And it's basically Superman and Untermensch kind of economics. That's basically what they believed in and do believe in, which is why you had a budget where they say we're going to make work pay by cutting benefits. That's what Kwasi Kwarteng said in the budget. So we know what they were about. I thought she didn't believe any of that stuff, and it was just a way of getting to the top. But she actually did it. You know, first chance she got, her and Kwarteng basically tried to introduce Singapore on Thames, and this is the ultra fantasy of the Brexiteers, that we will become a low tax, low wage, low regulated, get rid of health and safety, get rid of rules, don't let companies send kids up chimneys if they can make it pay, all this kind of stuff. The people who push this fantasy have no idea how Singapore works. They ignore the fact that lots of industry in Singapore is nationalised, and that tax rates are very low. But then there's a 20% compulsory savings rate, which you have to save for the government, and the government then invests that in nationalised industry. I mean, they don't get any of that. They just see it as this kind of wet dream of low tax, and they also forget the fact that Singapore is a highly successful entrepot in the Middle East. In the Far East, between China and India and China and America and Australia and the Philippines. And it's at the crossroads of the developing economies, the fastest growing economies in the world. And it trades with all of them. And then they say, well, we're going to do the same in the UK. And you're going to say, well, you've just left the EU. So who's going to ship all their stuff to the UK and then face £7 billion worth of red tape to get it into the next door market of 450 million people? They're going to go to Rotterdam or Amsterdam or Hamburg or Marseille. It's just a sick fantasy. But that was the point. All the ultras, the 6-year progression has been the ultras demanding more and more and more. The more radical and determined and libertarian right-wing fantasy of ever lower taxes for the rich, and those taxes trickling down to the poor, which no one believes. The Laffer curve, which they tell you says that if you cut taxes, more money comes in. It doesn't say that. It never has said that. It was just seized by the right wing as an excuse for cutting the taxes for rich people. A rising tide lifts all boats. Yes, but funny enough, the Gin Palace with 2 helicopter pads seems to rise much faster than everybody else and never sinks again. I mean, it's just a joke. And this is what finally broke the camel's back, because in the end they said not only does cutting tax for millionaires encourage growth, but we can borrow the money to cut taxes for billionaires and it will encourage growth. And the markets, which are red in tooth and nail, I mean, there isn't a Labour voter in the city of London, as far as I know, took one look at it and they just sold everything with a Union Jack on it. They spent 20 years trying to undermine the EU and take us out. They spent 6 years after that undermining any deal with the EU, trying to make it ever more radical, to make it ever more libertarian. And they got their hands on the money and they crashed the economy. The consequences of that are going to be dire. House prices will collapse. Borrowing costs are shooting up, both for the government and for everybody else, on credit cards, car loans, mortgages, the lot. People who don't know how they're going to heat their houses this winter now don't know how they're going to afford the mortgage when it's when the fixed rate ends. It's going to be an utter disaster. And yet you might think that they'd learnt their lesson and that they'd suddenly realised it was all going wrong. To be fair, some of them are now moving. Jeremy Warner today basically said, Project Fear was actually right and we were wrong. The vast majority of them are still doubling down on it. I was reading the Telegraph this morning and they were saying, the Blob or the Remainer traitors have undermined the Prime Minister. It's all the media's fault. We must keep going. The one thing we must do is tear up all the EU red tape. That at least would be a success. And you're going to go, well, you can tear it up, but you're still going to have regulations. So you're just going to replace it. And business is complaining about that already, because they're going to go, you keep telling us you're going to tear up all the regulations and the rules, but you're not telling us what you're replacing it with. So how do we know how do we invest? What do we know what rules we should be following? So business investment in these circumstances has flatlined since 2016 and doesn't look set to recover anytime soon. So who would invest in it? And what company would say, I think the Sunlit Uplands are just around the corner, let's invest. Now, when I said I thought there was a bit more reality or realism, I was listening to the Today programme yesterday. In fact, I was listening to Today on Friday, in which a right-wing Conservative MP said, well, the Taxpayers Alliance says there's £7 billion of fraud in government spending, that Quango's costs 16 billion a year and HS2 will cost another 30 billion. If we cancelled all that, we'd have enough money. So what's the problem? Well, the first two are fantasies. The idea that you could stop all fraud immediately and count that as an economic gain is a joke. Abolishing quangos is fine if the quangos do absolutely nothing, but things like Ofgem and Ofwat and quite a few others do things, so you'd have to spend the money doing it anyway, so the savings aren't there. And funny enough, the way to encourage growth is to improve your infrastructure. So actually cancelling HS2 would destroy growth. And he was just a right-wing Tory MP who was obviously an idiot, who believes this stuff. The taxpayers' allowance tells himself, and he comes and repeats it. Rather more worryingly, yesterday I was listening to the Daily programme, and first off they had John Redwood, who said the solution to all these problems was fracking and growing more of our own food. The idea that fracking would encourage growth is a joke. We still have 40% of our energy coming from the North Sea. Not so long ago, we were an energy exporter, and I don't remember petrol prices being any cheaper then because of that, or people getting free central heating. It's a side issue. The idea that we need to grow more food is basically, Brexit is now dig for victory, and growing more turnips will, encourage growth. I mean, it's beyond a joke. There is a P.G. Woodhouse character, I can't remember his name, it's Spode, who's actually based on Mosley and goes around saying that everyone should grow more turnips. And frankly, it was funny then, it's not funny now. And then yesterday they also had Jeremy Hunt on, who was trying to sound very reasonable and measured, and made quite a success of it, but basically said we're going to have to reverse everything and increase taxes and cut spending. There's the only way, because once you've lost the market's confidence, you can't just go back to your starting point. You have to actually go further to reassure them that you're absolutely dedicated to going in the opposite direction. So it's going to cost even more to get out of this. But what he said, he was asked, isn't it true that the Conservative Party is split, completely split? I'm just going to try and find it. I'll just turn the page over a bit. And his response was, oh, the big Brexit divide has been settled inside the Conservative Party and everyone now wants to get on and make a terrific success of Brexit. Well, no. Actually, you just proved that Brexit is a disaster, and still you can't see it. There's none so blind as those who can't see. The collapsing services, the economic mismanagement, the 6 years of broken promises and the ultras taking over and lying have finally been seen by everyone, except the Conservative Party and those ultras, as having been a disaster. The opinion polls have shifted, the public have woken up, and therefore, there is some optimism that the Sunlit Uplands are out there. It's just they're further away than they used to be, and they're harder to reach because we've been marching in the wrong direction for 6 years. So we're just going, and we're not going to stop marching quite yet, but hopefully, reality will now reassert itself, and we will turn around. So how do we get to those Sunlit Uplands? Well, I've already gone slightly over, so I'll be very quick. We're going to have a huge recession. We're going to have growth of 0.8%. The things that will encourage growth and productivity are also actually quite expensive. So there is a serious problem. But there are things we can do. We need to maintain investment in infrastructure. We need to fix the apprenticeship system, which was reformed by the Tories 6 years ago and has led to a drastic fall in the number of apprentices. We need to put more money into education. We need a health service which gets people back to work when they're ill. We need more immigration because we're running out of workers. And the elephant in the room is we need to do something about Brexit. The idea that we can just rejoin the EU, it's not going to happen. They wouldn't have us. It'll take years. It will take all the major political parties to agree that we must rejoin and we can never leave before the EU would even look at it. But you can do a lot of things. All those things I said we should have done in the first place. You basically go back and say, we promise not to tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol. We promise that we will stay with your veterinary standards, your sanitary and psychosanitary standards. We will rejoin CE, which is the mark on virtually everything you own, including this mouse here and everything else, which says it can be sold anywhere across the EU because it meets EU standards. All these things could be done quite easily, quite simply. We'd put a bit of money into some organisations so we could rejoin them. We would have our data laws in lockstep with the EU's. We wouldn't have our feet under the table. We wouldn't have a say in new regulations. That would be difficult, but we would have almost seamless trade with the EU. And that would make a huge difference, because one of the biggest gains Britain ever had was joining the EU and therefore attracting Nissan and a dozen other companies from Japan and thousands from around the world who came here because England is a good place to do business, and the UK was relatively low tax and everyone spoke English, and we had seamless access to a market of 500 million people. That's what we threw away. And that's what the Sunlit Uplands are going to have to be. We are going to have to find a way of getting seamless or near seamless access back to that market. Growth is dependent on education, training, infrastructure, the rule of law, so promising not to break your word, promising not to tear up treaties, and access to your biggest neighbours. This is called the gravity theory of trade. You do more trade we do more trade with Ireland than we do with the whole of South America, or some ridiculous statistic like that. We've got to be sensible. We've got to have common sense. We've got to do more trade with our neighbours, and we've got to stop treating them like they're complete shits and our enemies. They are actually our friends, and we've got to persuade them that we want to be friends with them again.